Layla's presence was like a beacon. Wherever she went, heads turned. Her skin seemed to catch the sunlight in a way that made it glow, and her long, flowing hair danced with the wind. Yet, the way she walked, her chin always lifted high, her gaze cutting through anyone in her path, told a different story. Her clothes were rich and bright, far too fancy for the dusty road she walked, but she wore them with an air of superiority. As she passed by, people whispered and pointed, though she didn't care. Their admiration meant nothing to her. They were beneath her. Up ahead, sitting by the road, an old woman stretched out her shaking hand. Her clothes hung loose, tattered and torn, and her face, lined with hardship, turned toward Layla with hope in her eyes. "My child," the old woman called, her voice weak. "Could you spare a little money? I haven't eaten in days." Layla stopped, her lips curling into a sneer. She looked the woman up and down, her eyes full of disgust, before scoffing. "What do you think you're doing, asking me for money?" Her voice was sharp, like a knife slicing through the woman's hope. "Look at you. What did you do with your youth? Didn't you plan for this? Now, here you are, begging. Do you expect me to help you?" She waved a hand dismissively, shaking her head. "Ridiculous." The old woman's shoulders sank, but her voice remained calm. "Life is hard, my child," she said softly, her words like a faint echo. "Not everyone is as fortunate." Layla's laughter rang out, cold and mocking. "That's your problem, not mine. Next time, use your youth wisely. Don't come to someone as important as me, begging for help." Without another glance, Layla strode past, her heels clicking against the dusty ground. Behind her, the old woman watched in silence, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Her eyes darkened, and she whispered words that blended with the wind. The trees rustled, and the air grew thick. From this day forward, the old woman's voice rose with an eerie edge. Though Layla was too far to hear, "You will learn the hard way. Your pride will be your undoing." Layla didn't notice. She carried on, her step steady, her gaze fixed ahead. But then, something began to change. It was subtle at first. A tingling, a strange pull whenever she passed a man. Her breath quickened, her pulse raced, and before she could stop herself, she found her body moving toward them. Each time, it was as if her mind was no longer in control. Whispers began to follow her. Eyes lingered. People in the village started exchanging glances when she passed, and their hushed voices soon carried to her home. Her father, once the proud minister of the village, now avoided the public eye. The house, once filled with respect and honor, was thick with shame. The silence between them grew louder. Her mother's eyes, once warm and full of pride, were now clouded with worry. In a desperate attempt to escape the rumors, Layla's parents packed her things and sent her away to the city, to live with Richard, an old friend of her father. They said it was for her studies, to help her focus and learn city life. But the truth lingered in the air, unspoken. The city felt different. Richard and his wife welcomed her with open arms, unaware of the shadow that had followed Layla from the village. Days passed, and though she tried to blend into her new life, the curse remained. It was late one evening, the air thick with the smell of the night. Richard's wife had gone out to visit a friend, leaving the house quiet, except for the faint hum of the city outside. Richard's gaze followed Layla from across the room. It lingered longer than before. She felt it. His steps were slow, calculated, as he approached her. Layla's pulse quickened, and though she wanted to run, her feet wouldn't move. His hand reached out, brushing her arm. Layla's breath hitched, her body betraying her once again. The curse was strong, stronger than her will. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but it was as if an invisible force held her in place. The house had an uneasy silence, the kind that felt heavy, like something dark hung in the air. Layla was in the corner of the room, her hands clasped tightly together. She wasn't praying, not anymore, but her fingers trembled as if they wanted to. Her eyes darted towards the door, hoping it wouldn't open. Yet, as the heavy footsteps drew near, she already knew what was coming. Richard's wife had gone out again, and that always meant one thing. Layla straightened, but her heart raced, as if it had a mind of its own. She wished she could run, or disappear, but something deeper held her in place. It wasn't the fear alone, it was the curse. He came into the room with a quiet grin, like he owned the world. Layla's breath hitched. She tried to move, her feet feeling stuck to the floor. Her throat tightened, words choked back before they could form. Richard's hand reached for her arm. Her body flinched, but the curse weighed her down, every movement slow, powerless. It wasn't long before his son started watching, his eyes lingering too long. Layla felt them on her, even when she wasn't looking. And then came the touches, light at first, curious, as if testing her. Layla shrank, her mind screaming, but her body refused to obey. The curse had turned her into a puppet, with invisible strings she couldn't cut. Each day felt like a punishment she couldn't escape. The house that was meant to be her sanctuary was now a cage, and she was its prisoner. Richard's wife began to notice, though. She would come home, her face drawn into a frown as her gaze swept over Layla. But Layla couldn't explain. How could she? What words could she find to say she was cursed? Who would believe such a thing? She swallowed her pain, eyes downcast, her heart a heavy stone in her chest. The wife would stare longer, suspecting something, but Layla kept her silence. One day, Layla heard the front door close behind Richard's wife, a sharp, final click of the lock. The house felt smaller, tighter, like it was closing in on her. She heard the familiar shuffle of Richard's feet, coming closer, and her pulse quickened. The room seemed to shrink as they were left alone. Layla edged away, her movements sluggish. Her mind screamed for her legs to run, but they were slow to respond. Richard's breath was heavy, his hand reaching out, grasping. The moment passed in a blur of fear and helplessness, until a gasp shattered the air. Layla froze. Richard's face twisted, his eyes wide as he clutched his chest. His body crumpled, hitting the floor with a thud. Layla stood there, motionless, her breath caught in her throat. Panic swelled inside her, but still, her feet wouldn't move. Moments passed in a blur. The house filled with voices. Richard's wife burst in, her scream piercing the air. Neighbors gathered, their whispers like sharp cuts. Layla stood, trembling, beside Richard's still body. She tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come out. Eyes darted toward her, suspicion already blooming. The police arrived, their stern faces offering no mercy. Richard's wife pointed at Layla, her accusations sharp and unforgiving. She killed him, she spat, her voice trembling with rage. Layla's head shook, her lips parted, but no sound came. Richard's son backed his mother, his words adding fuel to the fire. The trial was long and cruel. Layla sat in the courtroom, her hands shaking as whispers filled the air. Stories from the village crept into the room. Tales of a young girl, arrogant and proud, now accused of seducing men and causing death. Her father, desperate, did all he could, hiring lawyers, pleading for his daughter's innocence. But it wasn't enough. The gavel fell. 15 years. Layla's world collapsed. Her father wept. Her mother's silent tears were worse. Layla was taken away, her future pulled from under her feet, her heart sinking with every step. In prison, Layla learned a new kind of pain. The curse followed her there, lurking in the corners of her cell, making her body betray her again and again. The prisoners weren't kind. Some saw her as weak, others as something to be used. Layla had no control. Her body moved against her will, bound by invisible chains she couldn't break. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and yet the curse never lifted. The guards noticed, their eyes cold, their demands harsh. Layla's shame grew, pressing down on her, heavier than the iron bars that caged her. She would sit in her cell, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the cracks in the wall, wondering what she had done to deserve this. The curse had taken everything, her freedom, her dignity, her future. She thought about the old woman, the village, the arrogance she had once carried like a shield. Now, she was nothing. But hope came in the form of a man. A lawyer kind and curious, who took an interest in her case. He visited her, spoke gently, and started digging into the past. Layla watched him with tired eyes, unsure if she could believe in hope anymore. Then, one day, the truth surfaced. Richard's heart had given out, not because of her, but because of his own actions. His secret drug use had been the cause. Layla's innocence was proven. The chains of her sentence fell away, but the curse? That lingered. When she left the prison after 7 long years, the air felt different, but Layla didn't smile. Freedom wasn't what she had imagined. She stood at the gate, the weight of her shame still heavy on her shoulders. She couldn't return to the village. She couldn't face the people who would whisper, laugh, and remind her of all she had lost. Her parents' faces flashed in her mind, the disappointment, the sadness. The curse had taken so much from her, and now, even her freedom felt like a bitter reward. Layla's story wasn't one of triumph. It was one of endurance. She had survived, but in the quiet moments, when no one was looking, she still wondered if the curse would ever truly let her go. The lawyer glanced at Layla as she stood by the doorway, her eyes downcast. He sighed, feeling a mixture of pity and frustration. He had freed her, seen the desperation in her eyes, and out of kindness, he had offered her a place to stay. She seemed so grateful, her shoulders softening with relief when she accepted. For weeks, the house was peaceful. Layla would sit quietly in the garden, sometimes staring at the flowers, her face almost hopeful. She even started smiling, a small flicker of warmth returning to her eyes. But then, things changed. The lawyer began hearing whispers from the neighbors. At first, he brushed them off. Layla. No, she wouldn't do that. But the whispers grew louder, persistent. His steps slowed as he neared home each evening. The once welcoming air of his estate felt heavy, as if it were hiding something from him. It wasn't long before one of the neighbors approached him. "I thought you should know," the neighbor began, eyes shifting uneasily. "It's Layla. She's been with, well, too many men. When you're away." The lawyer's heart sank. He rushed home, his chest tightening as he pushed open the door. Layla was sitting there, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up at him, guilt flooding her face. I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice trembling. But he had already heard enough. The lawyer didn't shout. His voice was calm, but heavy with disappointment. "You need to stop. Please. I gave you another chance for a fresh start." For a moment, Layla nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. She promised to change. And for that brief moment, it seemed as though things might actually turn around. But the very next day, the lawyer came home early. As he stepped through the gate, his eyes landed on Layla, this time, with the gateman. His hands balled into fists, not from anger, but from helplessness. He had wanted so badly to help her. "Layla," he called out, his voice breaking. She jumped back, caught in the act, and tried to explain, but the words crumbled under her shame. It didn't stop there. A few days later, the lawyer heard another knock on his door. It was the neighbor's wife this time, her face twisted in anger. "She's with my husband," the woman spat, not even trying to hide her disgust. The lawyer felt a weight crushing his chest. He couldn't bear it anymore. Layla had already been with most of the men in the estate. He knew that if he let this continue, it would destroy not just her, but the fragile peace of his home. That evening, Layla sat on the bed, her body hunched over as if the air itself had grown too heavy for her to hold up. She didn't look up when he entered the room. She knew what was coming. "Layla, I can't help you anymore," he said softly. His voice, though gentle, carried the finality of his decision. He couldn't allow her to stay. With slow, shaky movements, she packed her things, tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't argue, didn't beg this time. She had nowhere else to go, so she returned to the only place she knew, her village. As she walked into the village, it felt like the eyes of everyone were on her. The laughter, once full of life and joy, turned cold, sharp like blades cutting into her pride. The girls she once brushed off were the loudest now, their voices mocking. "Where's your beauty now, Layla?" one of them shouted, her words cutting deep. Layla's face burned with shame. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to shrink away from their words, but they followed her like shadows. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, her feet dragging as though the very ground beneath her wanted her to stay and suffer. Her head bowed, her once proud posture now broken. She barely made it to her parents' house before the weight of their taunts became too much to bear. Inside, she shut the door, her back pressed against it as tears flowed freely down her face. She stayed locked away, refusing to face the villagers, her sobs filling the small room as the days blurred together. Her parents, heartbroken by their daughter's fall from grace, tried everything they could. They reached out to anyone who might help, even searching for the old woman who had cursed her. But no one could find her. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. At night, Layla stared at the ceiling, her thoughts haunted by the memory of that day on the road. How arrogant she had been. She wished she had shown kindness, even a little. Maybe then, things would have been different. But now, the curse had wrapped itself around her life, and no matter how hard she fought, it only pulled her deeper. All she could do was wait. Wait for something, anything, to free her from the chains of her past. It was just another quiet day in the village, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty roads. Layla, her shoulders slightly slouched, moved through the streets unnoticed. Her steps were heavy, weighed down by the stories that followed her like a dark cloud. The villagers, though they no longer whispered when she passed, still watched her with cautious eyes. They knew her past, and so did she. But on this particular day, everything began to change. Jerry, the son of the richest man in the city, had arrived in the village. He wasn't like the other city boys who came and went, showing off their money and leaving behind empty promises. Jerry was different. Kind, soft-spoken, with a smile that reached his eyes. The villagers adored him for his generosity, but more than that, they respected him for his good heart. He walked the village streets like he belonged there, stopping to greet people, to help where he could. And when he first saw Layla, standing by the well, her hands gripping the rope tightly as if it was her only anchor, something inside him shifted. His eyes softened as he watched her, as if seeing something no one else did. She was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't just that. There was a quiet sadness in her eyes, something that tugged at him. He couldn't look away. Layla felt his gaze and glanced up, surprised. For a brief moment, her heart skipped. But just as quickly, the familiar shame washed over her. She quickly looked down, her fingers tightening on the rope, wishing she could disappear into the ground beneath her feet. Days passed, and Jerry's interest in Layla grew. He found reasons to pass by her house, to stop and talk when she was near. Layla, at first hesitant, slowly started to open up, though her heart remained guarded. She had lived with her mistakes for so long that she didn't know how to let anyone in. But Jerry was different. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't care about the stories. He saw her for who she was in that moment. His parents, however, had heard the rumors. They warned him. "Stay away from her, Jerry," they said. "She brings trouble wherever she goes." But Jerry brushed off their concerns. He believed in second chances. He believed people could change. One evening, under the soft glow of the village lanterns, Jerry invited Layla to his family's mansion. She hesitated at first, but there was something about the way he looked at her, like he believed in her, that made her say yes. She wanted to believe too, to hope that maybe her life was about to change for the better. The mansion was grand, larger than anything Layla had ever seen. As she stepped inside, she felt out of place, her heart racing. She caught her reflection in one of the large mirrors and for a moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. But Jerry was there, by her side, his presence comforting. However, that night, something unimaginable happened. Layla, overcome by something she couldn't control, found herself in a situation she never intended. In a moment of weakness, the curse that had haunted her for years resurfaced. She made a mistake. A terrible mistake. She ended up in the arms of Jerry's father, not because she wanted to, but because the darkness inside her seemed too powerful to fight. The next morning, the truth came out. Jerry found out, and the look in his eyes shattered her. The disbelief, the hurt, it was more than Layla could bear. He didn't yell, didn't curse. He simply turned away, his silence speaking volumes. In that moment, Layla knew she had lost him. She ran. Back to the village. Back to the small house she shared with her mother. Her chest ached as she gasped for air, tears blurring her vision. When she reached home, her mother took one look at her and knew something was terribly wrong. "I can't do this anymore," Layla whispered, her voice broken. "I can't keep living like this." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let Layla go. She held her, whispering softly, "There is still hope, my child. Don't give up." For days, Layla stayed in the house, her mind swirling with regret and shame. She thought about ending it, about disappearing from the world entirely. But then, she remembered a story her mother had told her, about a man of God who lived not far from the village. He was known for helping the lost find their way. With nothing left to lose, Layla decided to go. The man of God welcomed her with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He listened as she poured out her heart, confessing her mistakes, her fears, and the curse that had followed her all her life. She wept, her tears falling onto the floor as she spoke. The man didn't judge her. Instead, he told her something she had never considered. "The woman who cursed you is gone," he said softly. "But the curse, it only has power if you let it. The only way to break free is to give your heart fully to God. Only then will you find peace." Layla felt something stir inside her, a flicker of hope. With trembling hands, she knelt on the ground and prayed, surrendering everything to God. For the first time in years, she felt a weight lift from her chest. It was as if a light had broken through the darkness, and for the first time, she could breathe freely. In the months that followed, Layla changed. The villagers noticed it too. She was no longer the troubled girl they had once whispered about. She had found peace, and with it, a new sense of purpose. She stayed close to the man of God, learning from him and growing in her faith. And then, one day, something unexpected happened. Matthew, a kind and wealthy young man, came into her life. He didn't see the Layla of the past. He saw the woman she had become, strong, kind, and filled with love. They fell in love slowly, their bond deepening over time. When Matthew asked her to marry him, Layla said yes, her heart filled with joy. Their wedding was a celebration of love and redemption. The villagers, once wary of her, now looked at Layla with admiration. She had risen from the ashes of her past, and her story became one of hope. Years later, as Layla sat by the fire with her children gathered around her, she smiled, remembering the journey she had taken. She was no longer the girl haunted by a curse. She was a mother, a wife, and a woman at peace. And she knew, without a doubt, that no matter how far someone falls, with the right choices and an open heart, they can always rise again. If this story resonated with you and you're looking for more uplifting and inspiring tales, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, let's explore stories that highlight the incredible strength of the human spirit and the blessings life brings. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I'm excited to share more stories with you in the next video. Remember, embrace the positivity around you and believe in the incredible beauty of life. Let's keep inspiring one another.